Just start this work session. This work session is on 2017-337. Basically, it's the stormwater manual. Let's go around the table and identify ourselves for the record. Lisa, we'll start with you.
Lisa Slusner, Deputy Municipal Clerk.
Eric Croft.
John?
Weddleton. Christopher Constant.
Dutray?
Felix Rivera.
Suzanne Crick.
Peterson. Forrest Dunbar.
We're all going to do that for
Okay, who's presenting this to the body?
Christy Bischofberger from Municipal Watershed Management, and I'm here with Janie Dussel, who is my contractor with AWR Engineering.
Welcome to me.
Yeah, long day.
Ready to go?
Go ahead.
Okay, we're bringing up a PowerPoint here.
On behalf of Mr. Weddleton, I'm going to move that we go page by page through the manual.
I thought we'd go nothing less than page by page.
Was it overwhelming?
No, it's actually very well written and quite enjoyable to read.
Good.
I checked some of the math.
We've just been at this for hours, and we got hours yet to go, so.
Well, you know, it was clear to us that at least some of you really read this manual, because the feedback I got in terms of edits, etc., was spot on and very detailed. And I did put this meeting out to the committee that we had worked with, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, but there's a few people here today who have an interest in the outcome of this, and you might want to point to them at some point. Okay, drainage design criteria, in case anybody was thinking this was about something else. And as we already pointed out, I'm Christy Bischofberger. I'm with Watershed Management. I'm the watershed manager for Anchorage, and Janie has been working with me for some time to put this together. So what is the design criteria manual? It is the guidelines that Anchorage uses to do all development in Anchorage, and it applies to both municipal projects and private projects. It applies within all service areas, Sparta and land use, and hillside. The drainage manual that we're talking about today is actually chapter 2 of the full drainage criteria manual, which I'll probably start calling the DCM from this point forward. There's rewrites in the works for all of the other chapters, and I think some of those have gotten a little bit sidetracked because the municipal engineer retired, and the new guy is in the process of picking them up and familiarizing himself. But then the other reason that drainage is first has to do with some mandates. In 1988, I don't know if it was the first DCM was written, but it was in place for a number of years until 2007, which is our currently adopted manual, took its place, and that was based on a number of issues that were taking place around Anchorage, and particularly up on the hillside. It was becoming clear that Anchorage was behind on its drainage requirements. That brings us to where we're at today, which is moving toward, fixing 4 manuals. There was the 2 design criteria, both design criteria and the drainage design guidelines that went with the 2007 DCM. And then there was a couple other manuals that we were dealing with in this rewrite that were done at different times over the years by different people and for different purposes. So we were able to grab all of these together to put them all in one and simplify things. And that was one purpose of the update. Other purposes were to pick up some mandates from our APDES permit that require us to do a couple of things, including green infrastructure, which I think we'll refer to later. And then the 2007 DCM, while it was 4 manuals, it was also not ideal. It had some faults, and we needed to address those. So feedback that we got from the community, from internal folks, different, everywhere, we were able to grab feedback from them and include it in this manual. We started years ago on this, pretty much as soon as the 07 DCM was out, but we started in earnest in 2010. We were able to take the 2010 APDES requirements, and then we were able to put an internal discussion together about those. But then in 2013, we went out to a meeting of experts, if you will, around the community and put together a working group that we ran for a couple of years until we got a draft manual out for review. And that was out for some time. And then we took those comments and did another draft out of those. And then from there, we're even on another draft since then. And in February of 2017, we took that draft to the P&Z. And their recommendations were in the packet I gave you. I think it was item 8. So you probably had a chance to see those. But they did recommend for adoption. And let's see, what else can I tell you about that? Well, let's move on. As I pointed out already, the update process did include an external committee, and there's also one of your item numbers, might have been item number 7, included who was in that update process, who was on the committee. I can find that right now. I don't know. Let's see. The committee, that was item number 3 in the packet that I gave you. Let's be correct about that. There was 10 participants, and we went through that document page by page to get where we were when we went out for the 2015 draft. In addition to having the committee, we did some low-impact development workshops presenting these ideas, and we've had a number of presentations at watershed updates over the years that we've been working on this. So we took that then and talked to some specific groups, the landscape architects, the civil engineers, the transportation engineers. Everybody we could think of to reach out to, we have reached out to, and since then we have taken the last 2 drafts and talked to the Home Builders Association as well. So we are now finally arriving at the 2 manuals that you were given as item 4 and item 6 of the packet. They are the Anchorage Stormwater Manual Volume 1 and Volume 2. And that brings us to a little bit of discussion about what's in those manuals, and we're going to focus primarily on Volume 1 because it's the immediate. And by the way, if you have questions as we go, I don't know, do you want to ask them as we go, or do you want to save them to the end?
Let's switch the body. John, you want to ask questions now?
I emailed some questions. Did you get those?
I do have those, and
You have them and I
talk about
don't,
them
so I'll
whenever you
just
want
trust
to.
that you go through. I think I just had 4 points.
As we go through, they'll come up.
Okay.
Suzanne, do you have any questions? Why don't you continue now, and they'll notify me when they want to talk.
Okay.
Okay, so, as Christy said, my name is Janie Dufel, and I've been helping with this project for a number of years. And I'm going to talk to you about specifically what has changed. So from what we have in our current criteria today versus what is in the 2 manuals that we are proposing adoption for. The first rather significant change that I want to talk about is our project classifications. So project classifications are basically how we categorize different types of projects based on which requirements apply to those projects. So we made a few changes. Our current project classifications did not have a 10,000 square foot threshold, which we need based on our APDS permit. So the APDS permit calls for some additional requirements for projects that are 10,000 square feet or more, and we didn't have a break there in our current classification, so we made some modifications to what we have now. The new project classifications have also been simplified. We went from something, I believe 9, how many we have now, to 4, which makes these a little bit easier for folks. The 4 project types are, we have exempt projects, small projects, medium projects, and large projects. So as I talk about each one of these and I go through and talk about the requirements that apply to each one, something important to keep in mind is that generally these requirements do not apply to single family or duplex construction if it's not part of a common funded development. So those types of developments are actually handled completely differently within the municipality, and this document is not typically applied to them. So just something to keep in mind. So exempt projects are specialized types of projects that are basically exempt from most stormwater management requirements. Examples of projects that we included as exempt are culvert replacements, projects that are intended to relieve groundwater flooding, mill and pave type projects, things that projects that install things like pedestrian facilities, handicap access ramps, bike lanes, things like that that don't typically change the flow regime or runoff characteristics. Small projects then are one step up from that. Small projects are less than 10,000 square feet, which means that you don't have to apply the APS permit requirements to them. Or if for some reason a single family resident or duplex comes in with a very large filling grade permit and does get classified so that the DCM applies to them, we classify those as small also, so that they don't have to do some of the water quality treatment things. A medium project then is the next step up from that. It's more than 10,000 square feet, but less than 3/4 of an acre, and doesn't change land cover by more than 5%. So medium projects are a little bit bigger, and then large projects is everything else. Most projects, large development projects are going to fall under large. This is a table that shows you the requirements of each project category based on what I just described. So you can see exempt projects pretty much don't have to do anything. Small projects do a little bit more. Medium projects a little bit more, and then large projects have to do pretty much all of it.
John has a question for you, man.
Sorry,
John?
backing up to page 6. So if you're on the hillside and you want to bring in some fill to level a lot a bit, is 5,000 cubic yards a lot?
It's quite a bit, yeah.
So if I were doing it, what did they do on those houses on Prominence Point?
That was done as part of a common
But
plan
just say at
development.
home then, I can visualize that.
If
at
it was
home.
just one and it wasn't,
Were they bringing in 5,000 cubic yards?
I don't know.
Is it on that order? I don't know. I don't know these things. Is it 20,000 or 2?
I would say some of those lots, the ones that needed to be more leveled so that they could build a flat pad, yes, they probably brought in more than 5,000 yards. Some of them that they actually built it into the terrain a little bit, probably not. So I'd say you have a mix.
Okay.
But that entire development was done as a
Right, I
common.
understand. That was a
yeah.
bad but
Yeah, yeah.
there are hillside homes that would trigger this and have to meet the DCM rules.
Yes, and that, we're not changing that. So that's in here as a clarification because that's done today.
Right.
So if they hit the 5,000 cubic foot or 5,000 yard threshold, the DCM gets applied to them today, which is why we put them in the small project category to make sure that we try to make it as easy as possible for these types of
Yeah, good.
developments.
All right,
So
thanks.
that's a lower,
Chris?
less than
Yeah.
35.
Chris has a question.
Junior, can you help us visualize what 5,000 cubic yards is as an engineer? Can you?
It's like, I think it's like 13 cubic yards on a side dump load, right? Is that
Yeah.
correct?
13,
So
so,
like a side dump you see on the highway is 13.
right, okay, so then 5,000 would be a lot. Okay, thank you.
Please continue, man.
Okay, so some of the specific requirements that we're introducing that are changes from what is in the requirements today. Is we have introduced a requirement to treat the first flush of stormwater runoff through green infrastructure and low impact development practices. So green infrastructure and low impact development are techniques that essentially mimic nature, that try to slow runoff down and encourage it to soak into the ground. Examples are rain gardens, bioswales, infiltration basins, things like that. So our permit calls for treatment of the first 0.52 inches of rainfall. So to help folks meet that requirement, we developed a suite of tools that will do that and establish some specific design criteria for Anchorage for all of those tools. And this is a list of those very specific design criteria for each one of these types of facilities in this manual. This previously did not exist. We didn't have that. So that's new. We developed those tools specifically to provide some flexibility for local site constraints. So in Anchorage, we have some specific conditions that required us to adapt the tools to our environment. Things like high groundwater, lack of surface space, poorly infiltrated soils, and things like that. So we did that to try to help green infrastructure be more feasible. We're certain, there's cases that it's going to be more challenging than others. So giving the tools some flexibility was one thing we did to try to encourage green infrastructure to be feasible. Another thing that we did was we created a thing called the 20% area allowance. What that basically means is that sites that have maybe challenging grading conditions or something like that can allow up to 20% of their site to go untreated if they treat an equivalent volume of water from somewhere else on the site. So the total volume would be the same, but would have one portion that actually doesn't get treated. So that came as a request out of the community that Christy was mentioning earlier. Another application of that would be a roadway that has maybe super elevated areas that, the drainage is actually going this way, but for some reason we have those super elevated roads and it needs to go another direction. Roadways with right-of-way widths of 60 feet, we also exempted from having to use green infrastructure. The basis for that is primarily because the right-of-ways in Anchorage that are 60 feet or less are usually being encroached upon by residential driveways. So if you actually took the full 60 feet, you would be taking a lot of actually people view as their front yards and their driveways. So there really wasn't a lot of room to do anything in a right-of-way that's that narrow. And then the last thing we did, and this is actually a pretty powerful thing, is we developed an alternative compliance option. So what that means is if green infrastructure has been determined to be infeasible because there are a lot of other conflicting municipal regulations, we have an option that would say, okay, let's work with you to figure out how we could actually work together on those regulations so you have a pathway forward to still incorporate it.
John?
So that leads to one of my questions, is I think your list of things that would say it's infeasible if
Yep.
small lot size, weird shape, et cetera, and so on. But there are, we have a goal of greater density in parts of Anchorage, like down here largely, and it didn't explicitly say, if you can't meet the expected density of the area, if you got a place that's zoned R4 or whatever, R3, and you simply can't meet the density that suggests because you're doing GI, seems like that would trigger
Yeah.
being infeasible, but it's not explicitly in there. Are we okay? Or do we
We
need to
tried
say
to
it?
sort of all encompass that when we said lack of available surface space. So that would be any development that is dense. It could be a residential dense development. The entire downtown area is a really good example of that because there just isn't very much surface space. So it isn't specifically addressed in that way, but it's intended to all encompass lots of situations that don't have enough surface space.
So you bring your project to someone at the front desk and they say, well, you could put it in this corner, just get rid of one of those units. And you have plenty of room. Then you have one less parking spot, you can put your little swale there or whatever. That person at the desk would be justified. But the developer could say, but wait a minute, we want more density here. That's why we want 7 units here. And I need that parking spot. Well, the developer loses, and we don't get the density we're looking for. It's just not very clear that, to me, is a reasonable criteria.
Well, so the other thing to keep in mind is infeasibility is usually not determined just based on surface space. So if that's your only constraint, since you don't have enough surface space, you probably are not infeasible because you could probably go subsurface, right? And you could do subsurface treatment that way. If you have very little surface space and you have groundwater at 2 or 3 feet, now you're looking at a legitimate infeasibility scenario. But if you did have that and a developer was struggling with suggesting you had a lot, that might be something that we would need to work with development on.
True, and your comment there, the reason we added green infrastructure / LID in this manual is so that we would have the flexibility of going subsurface. So I think we'll see a lot of those types of.
Can you have a parking spot on top of subsurface?
Absolutely.
GI, okay. Yeah,
It's actually done commonly.
thanks.
Thank you. Please continue.
Okay, so given all of that, which kind of leads to the questions you were just bringing up, but given all that, there are still going to be cases where green infrastructure is likely not going to be feasible, and we recognize that. So in that case, we have a pathway forward that folks can continue to do traditional treatment and extended detention in lieu of green infrastructure. In order to determine whether or not it's feasible, I just talked about some of the multiple constraining issues that would trigger an infeasibility determination. To help designers and site planners figure out whether or not they do have an infeasibility situation, we developed a form that kind of walks them through, did you think about A, B, C, and D? And then their responses are looked at, and then the municipality says, yes, we agree, it's probably infeasible. The same form is also used that you can request approval through alternative compliance. So you say, if I didn't have this other requirement prohibiting green infrastructure incorporation, this form would allow a case for that as well. And those are in Appendix LL of Volume 1. Okay, so switching away from green infrastructure, that's one big change. The other change that we made that's fairly significant is modifications to our detention and peak flow control requirements. What's in our current criteria was not working for a lot of people. We were hearing a lot of feedback that it was very restrictive, and looking at the downstream systems was very difficult to do. So we decided to give people options. So option 1 maintains exactly what's in the criteria today. Nothing has changed. So if you're happy with option 1, it's working for you, great, it's still there. But we introduced option 2, which people can choose if it works better. What option 1 says is basically you can only increase your peak flows from your site as a result of the development by 5%. And if you do that, you also have to look downstream and see what the impacts are. So option 2 says if you can maintain the peak flows off of your site and not have a significant increase, you don't have to look downstream. We will allow you to not consider the downstream analysis. That was actually has been received really well by the community that we have reached out to so far, because the municipality does not have a comprehensive master plan of our stormwater system, which means that whenever a downstream impact analysis needs to be done, a developer doesn't really have the tools that they need to know whether the receiving system has capacity or not. It's up to them to have to try to figure out that. And sometimes, in some cases, it's very complicated. So this gives people an option forward without having to look downstream.
And that's one of the projects that's wrapped into the stormwater utility consideration. So you probably heard a little bit about master planning when you heard about that last week.
So in both of these cases, option 1 and option 2, flood bypass is still required. So some people got concerned when we presented this that under a flood condition that means no consideration is taken, but people do still have to demonstrate safe bypass of very heavy flood flows. Another thing we did is when a downstream impact is going to be required, so if you choose to go with option 1 and you're still going to do a downstream impact analysis, we changed what that looks like a little bit. So we tried to provide some more flexibility based on the lack of information that we can provide to developers and designers. And basically, we put some flexibility in and allowed a little bit of designer judgment in terms of how far downstream you need to go with some guidance. And we also developed a step-by-step guide of literally how to do the downstream impact analysis, so step 1, step 2. So that was missing before and it's been added, so that's in the new document. Another change is our reporting requirements. They've basically just been standardized. In our current old criteria, there are several different types of reports that are based on what type of project you have. And what we heard from both the municipal reviewers and from the community is that was very confusing, and they would really rather see one type of report for all projects. So
John
that's
has a question for you, ma'am. John?
This is one of the questions I sent in, and I just, you know, so we're, in this year, requiring like bigger pipes and so on. And a lot of it would be GI, so most of it you want to stay on the property, but some that don't, so they're sending water down in bigger pipes. Does that cause a problem when it hits what we've been building for decades, that is a smaller pipe? That could happen fairly quick, right? What's the issue there? I mean, the facilities we've been building aren't this big, and now we're requiring bigger, and they can meet. Is that a problem?
Well, it will be a challenge. I don't think it will create any more of a physical problem than if we continue to build them to the smaller size now. You'll just have a little bit more storage in the pipe than you do now. Under a true flood scenario, though, we actually get our 50 or our 100-year event, yeah, there's going to be problems everywhere because our infrastructure is really not set up to handle that kind of event right now. So the municipality has created a coordination with DOT on how to deal with it when they have that situation. It's across different governmental boundaries, and private development has been working with individuals on the same issue. So we're not ever asking developers to go and upgrade that system downstream that we just described. What would potentially happen is if they're increasing the flows a lot, they may have to do extra detention, right? So they may have to hold them back and store them for a little while until downstream receiving capacity comes available. And that's happening now. That's not necessarily changing.
And it depends on how big the problems are downstream too.
Right.
There's some that, okay, the pipe's small, but there's others where there's examples of actual flooding going on.
Right.
I never worry that my understanding is that DOT builds the drainage along their roads to meet what is kind of the current drainage needs. So I look at O'Malley Road with this huge project, and we have plans for the new land use plan, much greater density in that area near H2 Oasis, for example. So they would have to meet probably a lot of GI in there, but what they put into O'Malley, very likely with a dense development, wouldn't be able to handle it.
So in theory, they have two options. If that development is if it's increasing the runoff a lot, so like maybe it's 10 times what it was today, if they go with option 1, they would have to do a full analysis downstream to figure out what the impacts are. And if they don't want to do any detention, then they would have to say, okay, they have two choices at that point. They can either do detention or they can improve the downstream system so that there isn't an impact, right?
Potentially, they'd have to go in the O'Malley Road right away and put a bigger pipe.
If we choose not to do detention, yes. If they
Any
go with
else,
option
John?
2,
No, that's good.
then they choose that they're going to do detention and not have any increase in our flows, and then they don't need to do anything downstream.
Chris?
And that's status quo.
Chris?
Yeah, so, you mentioned the stormwater utility. That conversation has begun. We've invested almost over $250,000 in investing in that question. And how does this interface with that when we get to projects and anticipating how this may change when that conversation comes up? Because this took 10 years to develop, or 8 years. And so how is this part of that conversation?
Well, this is the means by which we direct people to construct drainage around town. If the stormwater utility gets in place and then the master plan gets in place, if it directs changes to this, then this would change accordingly, but they would be more, I'm just guessing what they might be based on at this point, which is maybe how to make those connections, updates on that sort of thing.
It's probably worth noting too that something like that, like a change, like what Christy just described to this document, would not take 10 years. Part of the reason that this has taken so long is when we first started trying to incorporate green infrastructure as a requirement, we had two issues. One was the requirement was worded differently from APDS in that it was very inflexible, and it was we had zero flexibility what we could do with it. It was like you have to retain it on site. You can't clean it and then release it. You can't do anything. So for those sites that I just described that have those challenges like high groundwater and limited surface space, we had zero options there, right? So working with them to sort of come up with something that works better for acreage is one of the things that took a while. The other thing that we started with 4 documents and consolidated them into what we see now. So we wouldn't be doing that. We would just be needing to make a change to this.
So, please continue, ma'am.
Yeah, Jeff points out, a utility will need this design then.
Yeah. Okay, so this was another one of the questions that we got this morning. So one of the other changes of the new criteria is the addition of an O&M, an operation and maintenance agreement. Just a little background before I address the question we got. So the intent here is that there would be an agreement that basically says if you put in stormwater facilities on private property, you're going to maintain them, right? But the thing is, that's actually already being done. So right now, when you do a project and you submit it to the municipality, you have to submit also an operation and maintenance manual that you're telling the municipality, here's how I'm going to maintain this, and here's how often I'm going to maintain it. There is no way for the municipality to enforce that today. This is essentially the pathway forward to be able to enforce that, so that if things are not maintained on site, it doesn't cause adverse impacts to everyone else. Any other questions?
Chair's supposed to acknowledge me, but he's busy.
Go ahead.
Because this is something I know, I think Chris had mentioned and I did. So, because we have requirements now, you have to have a certain amount of parking, you have to have a certain amount of landscape, et cetera, and so on. And we don't have these agreements that we fill out and sign and allow the city to come in and replace the light bulbs on my light, or, you know, if I have too much snow to clear it. If you correct those things, there's a code enforcement. So if someone's not maintaining their parking lot right and so on, they call code enforcement. So why is this different than all those other things that we're required to build and maintain on our properties?
So I think there's a few reasons. One of them is that if you don't maintain your drainage facilities on your property, you have the potential to flood other people that are not on your property, right? So there can be property impacts outside of just your area. The other reason is because our APDS permit, this is called for in the permit for one thing. It's actually a permit mandate. But the reason that it's a permit mandate is because in the interest of keeping our receiving waters clean, if people are not maintaining these types of facilities, and this is what we, said, okay, that works for meeting our water quality goals, and then they don't maintain it, then in 5 years, it's not meeting the water quality goal anymore. So, do you want to add to that at all?
I do. Item 2 of your packet was the APDES requirements that we were trying to speak to when we went down this road. And we're certainly open to suggestions if you want to go another way, but in that case, it was page 23 of that handout on top, the reference page on top.
You're on.
Under 3.2.5, it talks about inventory and tracking and O&M agreements. And that's what we were, that's the mandate we're trying to take care of here. It talks about legally enforceable and transferable O&M agreement. And so that's the piece, how do you do a legally enforceable and transferable? I'm truly open to suggestions. This was what we saw when we looked around the country and when we looked at other, we looked at the parking lot agreements and we looked at on-site, all of those sorts of things. And that this is a combination of all of those examples.
John?
So what we made, the parking lot agreement's an interesting one. So, I have to have a certain amount of required parking on at my business, and if I don't, then there is spillover effect because they'll park on the neighbor's lawn. So kind of like the water, but if there's a parking agreement between two adjacent businesses, is that attached to the land, kind of like part of the plat or whatever, like this? Because that would be comparable to this in a way.
I'm gonna have to research the answer to that.
So to answer your question, when this O&M agreement was created and drafted, and it's actually a requirement right now before the DCM. So this is in effect. About 10 years ago, we started requiring the maintenance agreements, and about 2-3 years ago, they needed to be recorded. We looked at kind of what's being done in Washington and Boise, and there's places nearby that are also in the same stormwater region that we are. And this is what we came up with. And so, but one of the things that I looked at when it was drafted was the parking lot agreement, particularly to see how it would relate in our community in terms of recording against the title. So the short answer is yes, those parking lot agreements are enforced against the title. And that was, so I kind of took the stormwater stuff from other jurisdictions and our parking lot agreement and the legal with that and kind of squeezed them together.
Okay.
So
By the
give
way,
your
this
name for
is-
the record.
Jeff,
I'm Chapter Vance. I work for Watershed Management.
Just want to make sure the record's got your name on it. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, so following on that question, first, are there other places in this document, the DCM, that require recording against title?
this is the only thing.
And has a legal analysis been performed, and now that D just disappeared? Because this has ramifications well beyond an agreement to the muni, because it's literally recorded on the title. There are real property, financing, and other major stakeholders, if you will. And I didn't see any analysis of that, and I would love to hear kind of what the impacts are, not just physically downstream, but, financially and tidally downstream, title-wise.
So,
Go ahead.
the short answer is yes, it did go through legal, and I could reach out to you, maybe just, I don't know, some of the comments that they had, and so I can share those with you.
Yeah, it would be, I think, important to share with everybody.
And that's, I think maybe why that's not part of this is that project happened a couple years ago, but certainly we could, it's included in this document because it's stormwater related, but it was a permit requirement for the APDS stormwater permit that had a different timeline for implementation of the requirement.
Is it being implemented now?
Yes.
Yes.
And are there examples of these title recorded documents
Yes.
available
Yes.
that could be shared with us?
Yeah, and if I may just take the opportunity to make one other point of distinction. So these operation manuals, this is, they're prepared by the owner's engineer, and they're dependent on the facilities that are being constructed on property. And so we don't tell, so if they have a bioswale, or they have a oil grid separator, or they, have some other stormwater facility, it's the owner's engineer that has stated what are the maintenance requirements for that to function in perpetuity. And we are simply certifying the document the basis of the recorded maintenance is the engineer's, his plan for what needs to be done. So we're not telling people what they need to do. We're making sure that people are doing what they said needed to be done to keep these things functioning.
Okay, so I would like, if we can, to have legal analysis shared with the body, and also some examples of these recorded documents.
Mr. Gates?
I can give you enough kind of legal analysis, which is about real property 101. There's a couple other 20 things correctly. So I won't say this is for sure. But generally, an agreement that has some maintenance requirements in it for a property owner are called covenants that run the land. And can record those in the recorder's office so that they can already put title, show up in transactions. They're very similar to what you see in condominiums. They have DCCRs, declarations, covenants.
Covenants.
Yes, exactly.
That's
So
true.
that's kind of what the characteristic of this sounds like to me. Just that we didn't review any of these or any news that we're talking about. So legally, I think this is something that's possible. Yes. And that's the kind of character of it, covenant words demand.
So, yeah, the legal analysis, I'm interested in, not so much is it legal, I assume it's legal. The question is, what happens with these other parts of the transactions on this land? How does it impact? That's the kind of analysis I would like, if we can find that. Because obviously, it's generally, what we do is legal, not all the time, of course, but it's really what happens to all those other parts of the deal down the road, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. So.
What we're going to do now, we're gonna finish this up, and then I wanna go to the audience for about 10 minutes. So we got some engineers that would like to discuss this with us. So maybe we could finish this up in about 5 minutes.
Yes, I will just kind of breeze through the last two slides.
Thank you.
Another update that we did, that's changed is our Greenfield design form, which I think, we alluded to earlier. We updated them based on, the best criteria we have available now, which is from NOAA. One of the other things that was in your packet was a comparison of those design norms versus what we are designing to today. There has been an increase of about anywhere from 20 to 30%, depending on which event you look at. And we've been working with people to sort of demonstrate what the impacts of incorporating that are, so that it's not necessarily.
So that was what I was waiting for. So we're updating our definitions of how often these peak flows will happen based on more data. That is, a 50-year is more likely than it was 30 years ago?
Not so much that. So what we're updating is we're saying statistically which event has a 10% probability of occurring in any given year. So statistically, before we thought it was 1.77 inches, and NOAA has come and shown that it is 2.28 instead. So not so much that we're saying they're going to occur more often, but we're saying statistically a 10-year event is a little over 2 inches.
It's more intense than we thought it was.
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Croft. Anything else? By the way, we have
No.
donuts he's passing out. They're non-taxable, so if you want a donut, have one. Tax dollars do not pay for them.
We reorganized hydrologic methods. Nobody has had anything to say about that. It's fine. We updated some miscellaneous criteria for pipes, manholes, and culverts based on input from designers and from street maintenance. And we added an icing control design section that is hopefully helpful to designers. That's it for Volume 1. Volume 2 is our construction practices manual. This is based on what is the stormwater treatment plan review guidance manual. And the content is very much the same. There's very little changes to the content itself. The structure has been completely reorganized to be more user-friendly because we were hearing from contractors it was very difficult to follow. This is just a quick snapshot of what's in Volume 2. And then I think we wanted to talk a little bit about moving forward.
Yes, in summary of that, the process of updating the manual is something I would like as a takeaway from this entire process. They're new manuals. There's going to be things that need to change as we start to use them.
Sounds like Title 21 all over again.
Yes.
Yeah, so we need a process for moving forward and making those changes without hopefully having to bring minor changes like spelling errors and forms, that kind of thing to the assembly. So we would like to hear your thoughts or propose ourselves on where we might go with that.
John?
Right, we have the short circuit routine, I call it, for Title 21. You're familiar with that?
I'm not super familiar
You
with
might
it,
look
but
at that. We have one in certain cases, and it kind of describes what they might be. It could go directly to the assembly and bypass the planning commission. And they'll show it to the planning commission and get their
Through the chair,
agreement
Mr.
somewhat.
Wilson, I don't believe the same rules that
Chris?
dictate Title 21 amendments apply in this case, so there wouldn't necessarily be a need to short circuit. For the type of changes that she's talking about, we bring it directly to the assembly.
Well, this went through planning and zoning commission, though.
This one did.
But that's
for
not required?
For the particular section of Title 21 that you're referring to, code amendments and the process laid out in that title, we don't believe that this one will apply.
No, but I'm saying we could write something similar, parallel to that.
Correct.
So that you wouldn't have to go, because typically this would go through the planning commission if you had to change, is that correct? The DCM change?
It has, historically, yes.
So one of the things that we heard from planning and zoning, we were there, and I'm sure you've seen, the things that they said back to us, but one of the things that they said specifically was, we really don't wanna see this every time you go to make a small change, right? So one of the things that we thought about, you know, that Christy was just saying, having an advisory board, was one option that was thrown out by planning and zoning. You know, have a committee for consultation there, that they could, you know, be our professional, balance for making changes. So that was one option that planning and zoning threw out that we thought might work well.
John, you said yours.
That's future work. I mean, that's, you don't need anything right now. Could you guys propose something at some point? I mean, it's not, I mean, you could do it after Tuesday, right?
Okay, yeah.
And then just say, here's our proposal, and,
We appreciate that.
yeah, and then we'll look at it.
Okay, we have arrived to the questions.
Okay. Question from assembly members. Do you want me to go to the audience first? What do you want?
I hit my big one.
Your big ones are ahead. Chris?
Yeah, no, I'd like to hear from some of the folks in the audience.
Suzanne? Who would like to speak to us from the audience on this? Come to the forefront if you would. Just tell us your name, what you do, what part of town you live in.
Yes, sir. My name's David Grenier with Trident Engineering, and I was part of the committee that the year plus that we had on this subject. Hate to admit this, but I was also part of the 88 design criteria, so if you haven't blamed me, that may be a part of it. It was a good committee, a good process. We had a lot of high-level discussions, I think, a lot of philosophical things like this whole concept of keeping water on site. It has the potential of raising the groundwater, you know, water in crawl space. We had a lot of discussions about that sort of thing. And the process was good. There's, you know, it is addressed in the manual, so I think there are ways around that. We also talked about the lack of a master plan. A stormwater master plan is critical to the stormwater handling. It's like AWW, they've had one in place since '66, and the city has developed using that master plan all these years. It's been amended over the years, but it has worked very well. Nothing like that exists for storm drain. So we strongly support a master plan and also a storm drain utility that would go along with it. As far as the stormwater facility and the maintenance agreement, we agree that there's some long-term, we feel there's long-term consequences that we're not sure of. Recording it just amplifies those concerns. One of the options may be not to record it. Maybe stormwater can just hang on to the agreement. Another option is, having enforcement in the DCM is new ground, new territory. I would consider keeping the enforcement side of it, as far as the agreement, out of the DCM. There's 7 chapters, and this would be the only one. So I would like you to consider that. And the other thing, as far as the new criteria, using the new criteria, it basically places all the pipes, existing pipes in town, as undersized. And we had a lot of discussions about that as well. But with some new curve information, storm curve information, I think we've got a solution to mitigate to some of that.
Question from
With
assembly
that,
members. Suzanne?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So regarding keeping the enforcement out of the DCM, I know we talked about this a little bit. Can you tell me like which specific sections or how much of that, what part exactly?
that's called the Stormwater Facility Operation and Maintenance Agreement. And it's, I think it's an attachment to the agreement. It's not actually.
Oh, okay, so it's not in here now.
It is,
Okay.
it's appendix L.
Okay.
It's only just for the operation and maintenance piece. That's the only part of this that is enforcement. And it's a good point. The reason that it was put in initially is primarily because we wanted basically just to flag designers to let them know, hey, when you put this operation and maintenance agreement together and the owner agrees to it, it's going to be required, right? It's important. It's going to actually get recorded. We wanted there to be like a flag, like a heads up to know that that was happening. And Jeff pointed out it's actually getting incorporated outside of this document anyway. It's just incorporated here as mostly as a reference, really.
Well, it has legal ramifications.
Right.
That's the main thing. And the other thing, it only applies to new projects. What about all the existing projects that are out there? So, you know, it's a very small percentage of the projects that'll have this legal attachment to it.
And
It should be looked at system-wide, is our opinion.
Anything else, Suzanne? Eric and then Chris?
So these agreements had already been required, but they've not been recorded with the property, and your concern is, like, the concern that put it there was, we want it recorded so they're enforceable and can be watched and everyone knows, and you're concerned that it's a whole new thing and it may have legal consequences. We don't
Well,
see.
the wording is much more onerous. It has statements like, runs with the land, unrestricted authority to the municipality for access. If there's problems downstream, they can come and charge you. What's required now compared to this is miles apart.
And so to that, what's required now is sort of, they have these plans, but they're not very enforceable, and that was your concern?
If I could clarify,
Go ahead.
with not the current APDS permit that we're on, but the one that was started like 8 years ago, we had a requirement that all new developments submitted an operations plan. With the new permit that started 3 years ago, totally outside of the DCM process, there's language in there that states that those must be enforceable and transferable. And there was a timeline for moving those things that were previously submitted and not binding to now being enforceable and transferable. That requirement and the O&M agreements were initiated on that as part of that process. They've been in effect for 2 or 3 years. Whether it's in the DCM, whether it's not in the DCM, I mean, it was put in there for reference and consistency and comprehensiveness, but if it doesn't go in the DCM, it's an entirely different discussion on what happens with it. If it's in the DCM or it's not in the DCM, it's still a requirement of the permit that the city signs with DEC through the EPA.
Okay, so am I right, and I know we're coming up against time, but.
We have
this
6
was-
minutes left.
Yeah, this was not a requirement, then it was a requirement, but how do we enforce it? Then it was a requirement that ran with the land, and this is sort of the next evolution of that, increasingly, I mean, from their perspective, the ability to actually enforce these agreements, and from yours, a worry about what that does legally to transfer and other things.
Exactly.
Is that right?
The consequences, I don't think, have always been followed through or thought through. And I would suggest one option may be amend the permit, to address something as onerous as this.
Okay, just want to understand, thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, so whether it's in the manual or not, wherever it is, what's the current mechanism for enforcement that we're talking about?
Well, we haven't gone down that road, and like Jeff pointed out, it's the engineer and owner themselves that get to decide what's in the O&M agreement. The municipality is required to do some inspection, and then that enforcement, so far we've only inspected 2 because we only get about 8 per year, and they're just now starting to come to completion. So we haven't gone down this road, and I don't expect that it's going to be a problem just based on the construction program that we run. When we have a need out there, we go out and we communicate with the owner, the developer, and give them time to fix it. And when we come back, it's always been repaired, so.
So then it might seem like it's an important issue, but it sounds like it's a solution looking for a problem. And it's pretty draconian in some ways, if you think about it, that we are creating a permanent title document that we haven't had a problem enforcing, that we have, if we need, the permitting process to stop a project if it doesn't meet what it says it's gonna be. And if it's a commercial operation and there is some impact, we can, according to what I've heard, go back and figure out who created the problem downstream, and they can be billed for it already. So it seems like we have, I think we need to be really, really careful creating a legal burden on future owners of land. Really, really thoughtful about how we do this.
How about that in the form of a question? Why is it needed if his concern is correct? That is, if we haven't had difficulty, why do you think this running with the land or being reported is important for enforcement or other purposes?
It goes back to the APDS mandate and how we fulfill that requirement to the permit. And Mr. Grenier points out that maybe we could go back to the permit itself. We'll try that. I don't know how it'll turn out.
This meeting is just about over with.
A quick suggestion.
Last comment, sir?
I'm sorry.
Last comment?
Last comment, the, possibly the zoning enforcement model is how the Title 21 is enforced, might be a mechanism, something similar to that for stormwater.
We're now out of time.
Did you want to say anything?
No, I'm good. Mr. Grenier.
We're now out of time.
Issues have been addressed.
Thank you.
This meeting's over. Thanks for being here.